Thank you for turning up to listen to me. I think the talk this morning was absolutely outstanding. Now, this is going to be more like a university lecture, I think, for all of you. So this is going to be deep in data, and so it's quite a lengthy session, hour and a half. So the first 45 minutes, we'll be talking about the state of global peace. The second 45 minutes will be devoted to questions. So look forward to plenty of difficult, interesting, insightful questions from the audience. So without more to do, I'll start now. So the presentation consists of a number of different sections. So the first one's the state of global peace. The second part will be a little on the economics of peace. Third part is on what creates a peaceful society. That's called positive peace. And finally, I'll come round to a little bit of theory, which is reasonably dense, but I think for this audience it's fine, just on the relationship of societal systems and the way they operate. So it's a very, very different way of thinking. We all think we understand systems, but in reality, we seldom do. Generally, it's just a group of things we think go together to create a system, but systems have got certain ways of functioning, which I'll come to. So, the Institute for Economics and Peace was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace and economics. Place a special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, and then to ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. Today, we're situated in many different parts of the world, headquartered in Sydney, Australia, got offices in Brussels, Den Haag, Mexico City, New York, Nairobi, and now we've got satellite offices setting up in the Philippines and Portugal. Our media coverage last year was about 40 billion media impressions. That was from about something like, I think, 12,000 different articles. Social media reach was about 1.4 billion people. And we actually had an audience, and we actually had work, some of it only very small, but work done in over 150 countries using our frameworks around the world. And so we've got very well established. And we've got a global coverage as well. We've partnered with many, many organisations of the world. People like World Vision use it in their development work to frame their projects which they're doing for development. Organisations like the Philippines government have picked it up, rolling it out. Largest civil organisation in the world, Rotary, has adopted these frameworks, which it then shares with its 34,000 clubs around the world. And I could go more, but I think that's the end of the paid advertising, eh? Let's move into the results. So if we look at this here, this is just a quick map of the world. Gives an idea of where the most peaceful countries are and where the least peaceful countries are. The blue is very, very peaceful. The red is less peaceful. So it's just a quick take of the world. Now, if we go back and we look last year, what we found is that 65 countries improved, 97 deteriorated. So since the inception of the Global Peace Index, that's the most number of countries which have fallen. But as we get into this presentation, a lot of it will seem pretty dark. But what I want to say is that if we look at this, still an awful lot of countries have improved their peacefulness, an awful lot. So although this will be somewhat dark, a lot of the time what we need to do is really focus on the positive. So if we look back at it and we look over the last year, what we found, there were improvements in violent demonstrations. Terrorist impact was down again. And that's based on the average of the number of countries suffering from terrorism, although the number of deaths from terrorism did go up. Homicide rates are improving. That's fairly much a global trend, other than a few exceptional countries, and that's been going on for 15 years. Now, the deteriorations won't come as any surprise. Military expenditure is up. Now, what's fascinating about that, we look at the militarisation for the average country, it had been dropping for 15 years. And then, after the start of the Ukraine war, that changed. That's mainly because of the increased military spending by a lot more countries which are sitting in Europe and Western Europe. Not surprisingly, the other thing which has increased is the level of conflict and deaths from international or internal conflicts as well. There'll be a little bit more of that as we move on. These are the countries at the top. You'll note that 6 of them are in Europe, 3 of them are in Asia, and 1 of them sits in the middle of the Atlantic. Iceland's been at the top of the index the whole of the time. And when we look at it, and that's over the 18 years we've been doing it, and it's unlikely to get displaced anytime soon. Now, when you look at Iceland, there's very, very good reasons for why it's peaceful. And so as you're digging into the country, what you'll find is the last real war they had was 1,000 years ago. And the country is sparsely populated, and it's one of the most hostile environments in the world. So even up to about 30 years ago, you could walk into someone's house. If they weren't there, go into the kitchen, put the kettle on, fix yourself a cup of tea. Quite acceptable, because the conditions are so harsh, people would need to take refuge wherever they could. Each year, they come together to the centre of the country, and at the spot where you've got 2 of the fault plates meeting, and it's the most visible place in the world for where the fault plates meet. That explains all the volcanic activity. But they come together each year to set the rules of the country, and people had come from all over the island. And when they did, what they'd do is they'd set the rules, and then because it was so sparsely populated, you didn't have an army or a police force which went out and created the peace. The individuals within the country had to. And so they learned to police themselves. And similarly, the people who lived off the sea, quite often the men would be away 6, 12, 18 months. When they'd come back, they'd find their wives had had a child by another man. And so that created a whole series of ways of how they had to interact and work together. So the environment, in many ways, shapes it. But there is one joke. Why is Iceland so peaceful? It's so cold, no one goes outdoors. But it's not true. All right, we'll move to the other end of the table. And now we can see, when we look at this, every one of them is engaged in a conflict somewhere. And so conflict, which is quite obvious, leads to the bottom end of the table. Okay, now we look at the major findings. The likelihood of another major conflict is probably higher than any time since the inception of the Global Peace Index of the work we've got. Okay, so that's the bottom line. By the way, the image there, that's an AI generated image. So they're the kind of things you're going to see more and more and more of in the future. So there are more conflicts now than at any time since the end of the Second World War. So 56 active conflicts with more than 25 deaths. More countries are involved in a conflict beyond their borders than at any time since the inception of the Global Peace Index about 20 years ago. So that's 92 countries. It's a higher number of countries deteriorated in a single year since the inception of the Global Peace Index, again 20 years ago. So as I mentioned earlier on, 97. So worst year from that angle. 104 countries increased their militarisation in 2023. Again, that's the most since the inception of the Global Peace Index. So as we can see, this is sort of mounting up to not necessarily great signs. So we went back to the 1970s, 49% of conflicts finished with victory. Could that be either for the government or the rebels? About 30% of them were rebels, the rest were the government. That's dropped down to 9% in the 2010s. Now, we went back to the 1970s and we looked at peace agreements. 23% of conflicts finished with a peace agreement, and that's dropped to 4% in the 2010s. So the issue for peace is the ability to be able to find conflicts, tackle them and solve them before they become major ones, because when they become major and you get a lot of different regional or international players involved, they get very, very difficult to be able to solve. So, stronger focus. on developing the initiatives to solve conflicts is absolutely vital. So if there's one question I'd like this audience to take away, is that, well, there won't be one, there's going to be a number of things, but that's one which is really key. In the end, all this has profound economic effect. Now, if we went back and we looked at the Ukraine and we looked at Gaza in 2019, they were both considered minor conflicts. So now there are some countries which have done exceptionally well. So one of the biggest increases on the Global Peace Index is the Philippines. And I think we went back 20 years ago, it was something like they had about 57 different insurgencies running around the country. They're now down to 12. And so a lot of the time what they've taken is, quite a whole of society approach. So you need the military to be able to suppress the insurgents initially. But the military will never stop it forever. What you need is the social development programs to go with it. This would apply if there was a peace in Gaza, then this is the stuff you need. It's the development which goes with it, which brings the people along. Now, if we're looking at the amount of money spent on peacekeeping, it's 0.2% of the impact of the violence on the global economy, which I'll come to in a few minutes. But think of that. Now, if you want to create peace, the first thing you have to do is invest in peace. Would that seem logical? I think it does. Okay, this will give you an idea of the slope of the peace over the last 18 years. In all these graphs you see, not in all of them, but generally high is bad, low is good. So you can see in the last 18 years, there's only 3 years where peace actually improved. So again, just looking at this going forward, not a great sign for the future. Now, this will give you an idea. So there's 3 different domains in the Global Peace Index. So the first one's internal safety and security. The second one's ongoing conflict, and the third one's militarisation. We can see if it wasn't for the increases in militarisation, in many ways the world would have become more peaceful. Now, having said that, some people question, why do you have militarisation in a peace index? Doesn't militarisation bring peace? And so what I'd say about the index, it's agnostic. Okay, we don't make comments on conflicts. We'll leave that to other people. All we do is take measures. And so the definition used for the Global Peace Index is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And so the military, you have it for 2 reasons. 1, you want to use it for geopolitical influence, or 2, you're worried about your neighbours. So if you live in a violent part of the world, you need strong military defences. If you've got rebels operating within your country, again, you need to have strong military to be able to counter it. So the index isn't a judgment, but you only have the military because you want violence or you fear violence, one of the two. This will give you an idea of the indicators which have improved and the indicators which have deteriorated over the last 16 years. Note the ones which deteriorated the most are all the ones related to conflict. They're all the big red ones up the top. The very bottom one, the one which has increased the most, is funding of UN peacekeeping operations. Now, what's happened with the funding of UN peacekeeping operations, we've found as conflicts increased, more countries are now willing to commit to funding peacekeeping operations. So peacekeeping operations is optional for countries to spend, to actually fund it. It's not something which is mandatory like the core funding for the UN. So to give you an idea of the changes in conflict over the last long while. So if it comes back to if we look at the graph, which will be on your left-hand side, that is the state of conflict going back prior to just back to the end of the Second World War. And you'll note it's been really quite high, then it dropped right off. And so we're now seeing it start to climb again, but it's not back to the same level of what it was, let's say, during the Cold War. Now, if we now look at the number of active conflicts, we can see how that's been increasing. We can see how it's gone up recently. So if you're looking at the maroon piece on the top, that's what's called internationalised conflicts. That's the conflicts where you've got countries which are either regional powers or international powers involved in the conflict within the country. You can take some like Sudan at the moment, where you have about 8 different powers involved, one power which is actually backing both sides, 50-50 bet. Now this will give you an idea of the ranking for through Asia, the countries in the Global Peace Index. You'll note that New Zealand's at the top, Singapore comes second, Malaysia is now in the top 10. Congratulations to Malaysia. Any Malaysians here? Come on, there must be one. One hand, only one hand? Anyway, congratulations, 2 hands. Anyway, so there's something. Yeah, congratulations, Malaysia. So it's one of the rising stars. We'd see Japan, Australia up there, and then we move on down with obviously North Korea and Myanmar at the bottom, but very close, Papua New Guinea. If we look at the other side, it gives you an idea of the changes gives you an idea of the changes since 2017 in the region as well. And we'll see the Philippines right at the top. Thailand's done very, very well as well, as obviously Malaysia. So I'll give you an idea of the changes there. We now look at the region, and now we start to see the changes in the various indicators. So if we look at this, it'll give you an idea which indicators have actually improved and which indicators haven't. I won't bother reading them all out. I've got a screen at the front here. My eyes aren't that great, so reading the screen when it's fine print gets really difficult. All right, let's talk a little bit about the economic impact of violence on the global economy. So we've got 14 different dimensions we measure. Last year, that was $19.1 trillion. To just give you an idea, that's 13.5% of the global GDP. Or, as it says on the slide, 2,380 for every person in the earth. Just give you an idea, there are 80 countries where the per capita income for the country is less than 2,380. Now, no one in the room can actually imagine a world which is totally peaceful. But all of you can imagine a world which is 10% more peaceful. That's $1.9 trillion. So to put that into more meaningful perspective, that's like adding 3 new economies to the world, the size of Thailand, Sweden, and Ireland. Okay? 3 economies of that size. Now, if we look at the 10% also, that's a lot of money. So if we went back and we looked at all overseas developmental aid last year, whether it came from the US, whether it came from China, whether it came from Russia, whether it came from any of the European countries, that was about 1% of the cost of violence to the global economy, 1%. So now, if you want to have a peaceful world, we know that development's key. People whose lives are improving generally don't try and overthrow the system. So peace is built quite often on economic prosperity. Quite often in the peace field, that's something we lose sight of. The emphasis is just on justice. And justice is exceptionally important, but so is economic development. So now this gives you an idea of just we do a lot of work on media sentiment. So what we can do is take any 2 countries, we can look at the media articles and look at what's the positive sentiment and negative sentiment. So US and the Russia, we can see the changes in that sentiment over time. We can also see US and China's sentiment deteriorate over time. We can see China, and we can see that's hasn't changed that much. It's up a little bit, but not that much. And then we can see EU and Russia, obviously that changed around 2014 and it's got much worse in the last 3 years. So that gives you an idea of changing sentiment. And the key thing with this, if we got one on Israel, but it isn't in this, Israel and Palestine, haven't got it in this. So if the tensions are going off here, what you can expect is the future policies of those countries to reflect that in sort of the way they operate between each other. And it's particularly important when you start to look at this in terms of trade, particularly important. To give you an idea of military spending, this is gross military spending. So there's two ways of measuring it. One is the per capita income. One is the percentage of GDP spent on the military. The other's in absolute terms. This is in absolute terms. So you can see just the changes in it and over time, and you can see now just the way it's increasing globally. And I think at this stage, there's no sense that the arms race is going to stop anytime soon. Now, one of the other things which is important for peace is quite often the interrelationships between different nations, which can be expressed economically. And so what we've found is that the level of trade, it plateaued about 7 or 8 years ago. And what we can see now is it's just slowly coming off. Peaked a little bit last year, but I think that's more of a blip than anything else. And we can see, probably particularly with the new US administration, and they'll have a propensity for putting in trade barriers, that's only going to decrease as we move forward in time. So that, for me, is a very, very key graph of troubling times in the future. So let's have a look at terrorism. We'll see what we can see on that. So this gives you an idea of the terrorist attacks globally. The size of the circles indicate the size of the attack. The intensity of the red indicates the number of deaths. And what you'll find in that, the biggest attack was the October the 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. That was the biggest attack last year. And that was the biggest attack since 9/11 in 2000. So just to put it in perspective, and one of the biggest ones of all time. Now, if we come down, we can see the most intense parts are in the Sahel. And that's really the epicentre of terrorism these days. It's all situated in the Sahel. And this will give you an idea of the countries. Now, what's quite amazing with this, terrorism's highly concentrated. And you can see that just 87% of all terrorist attacks deaths occur in 10 different countries. So that's quite amazing. And what we also find, that there's an intersection between terrorism, deaths from terrorism, conflict, because all those countries are in conflict, and ecological degradation. So I'm not covering it in this, but we have another report called an ecological threat report. And what you'll find with that is the ecological degradation, conflict, and terrorism quite often go together. And there's all sorts of reasons why you get terrorism. They come down to a whole range of things, but probably the first thing is poor governments where they're unable to be able to keep control of their territory. If they can't control their territory, then militias come in and rise, and it's what happens if they get taken over by some form of radical religious ideology, which has happened, let's say, in the Sahel, then they become jihadist groups. Now, this gives you an idea of the most active terrorist groups in the world. And what you'll find is that Islamic State is still the most active terrorist group in the world. They're active last year in about 20 different countries. And a lot of the time, attacks aren't claimed, and this will be for a whole range of different reasons. Some of those reasons can be, well, if it wasn't all that successful, we don't want to claim it, or if it was too horrific an attack, then we don't want to claim it as well. So it can be either way. But what we can find is that the number of people who would be killed by Islamic State would have been 60% higher when we analyse it in detail. And so we use machine learning type techniques or some forms of AI to be able to determine and attribute attacks which are unclear as to who's enabled them. Now, if we look at this graph here, it gives you an idea of just the changes in Sahel over the years and the countries which have got the worst number of attacks. So as we can see that, it's the Burkina Faso is the one which is worse. And you can see from a decade ago, this has come from nowhere. And this, what happens is when you get states with weak governments, a lot of corruption and inability to be able to control their territory. Right, let's move down and we'll start looking at positive peace. So positive peace is the attitude, institutions and structures which create or sustain peaceful societies. And they consist of 8 different pillars which you've got here. Now, none of these pillars will be, how can I put it, counterintuitive. We can all see it. So it's things like well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources. That doesn't mean equal. It's whatever the social contract is around what's equitable. And that varies from society to society. Very, very different what the social contract is in the US compared to Scandinavia, or what the social contract is in a semi-nomadic tribe in Africa versus what would be considered appropriate in Bangkok. I got good relationships with neighbours, free flow of information, and that's basically the free flow of accurate and pertinent information, and that, again, that can come down and be dependent on the society around what's considered appropriate and inappropriate. High levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, and again, that comes back because what's accepted in one society may not be in another. So it's in terms of the way the society views its social contract again, rather than it's some broad-based concept of a acceptance of rights. Low levels of corruption and sound business environment. Low levels of corruption, when we do all the statistical analysis, is one of the key things associated with peace. So we use 2 forms of peace: positive peace, negative peace. Negative peace is the absence of violence or fear of violence. That originates with the Global Peace Index. The second one is positive peace, attitude, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. So they're the 2 types we use. So now, how do we get there? So the actual peace is actually the Global Peace Index. So what we do then, we've got about 50,000 different data sets, which we've got down in Sydney. We now run a whole lot of mathematical modelling, statistical analysis, determine the qualities which most closely associated with peaceful societies. That's what we call positive peace. We turn that round into another index, and that's called a positive peace index, and that gets profound. That gets really profound. It seems simple, but it gets really profound. Because what it does then is you can now start to look at the progression of societies, whether the underlying factor is going to move it towards peace or away from peace. So we take a long time factor on this, 10 years, and we look at the difference between the actual peace of a country and its positive peace measures, where the actual peace is much higher than what the positive peace measures, tends to come back and reflect positive peace measures over time. Not always, but when we're looking at the biggest differences, what we find is that 90% of those countries 90% of those countries over the last 15 years deteriorated in peace. So as a measure, for measuring peace, it's powerful. The other thing which it does, it gives you the ability now to start to look at what other qualities are associated with positive peace. So, for example, higher per capita income, and this is the value of peace. This is the value of peace. Higher per capita income, more resilient societies, better environmental outcomes as well as measured through the Yale indexes, higher measures of well-being and happiness, and better performance and development. Now, these are the kind of things which we all want for a flourishing society. Therefore, positive peace describes an optimal environment under which human potential can flourish. And that is profound news. So now we start to dig into this a little bit deeper. What we can see is that we started with peace and ended up with an architecture. You probably could have started in a number of other areas, ended up with a similar sort of architecture. But what it shows is peace is right at the heart of the very things which we all value in any society with any government which we're looking for. We all want to be better. We all want better, higher measures of happiness. We all want to have higher income so we can afford more, better development outcomes, and certainly want to see the environment better. So I'll give you an idea. So if we go back over a decade, countries improving in positive peace compared to countries deteriorating had twice as high GDP growth. I meant twice as high. That's really, really something. This is the well-being in positive peace, or well-being and happiness. Note how tight that correlation curve is. Just shows how strongly positive peace is related to personal well-being and happiness. And this is environmental performance. Again, we can see very strong correlation. And again, if we're looking at development outcomes, human development, the more peaceful society is, the higher the development outcomes are as well. So again, this comes back to describing an optimal environment which human potential can flourish in. Now, positive peace. So we've done all sorts of activities around the world on this, and I'm just going to run through a few now. But what I might do before hitting that, I'll just tell you a personal story. And when we come around to question times, if you've got questions around this, you can ask. But it's about my life journey, really. So I started off in business. So you set up 2 international IT companies, one publicly listed on NASDAQ, other on the Australian Stock Exchange. So I made a lot of money, created a whole lot of investments, then set up a family foundation to work with the poorest of the poor. And we've done about 280 programs around the world now, so we've done a lot. A lot of them up in Southeast Asia, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, for example, and a lot in Africa. And I was once in northeast Kivu in the Congo, walking through there, thinking, well, what is the most peaceful nations in the world? What do they look like? What's the opposite of all these stressed out countries? Because as I mentioned, the poorest people in the world are all in the conflict countries. So searched the internet, couldn't find anything, and that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But if a simple businessman like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world, and it hasn't been done, then what do we know about peace? If you can't measure something, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you know if it's helping or changing what's occurring in your life? You simply don't. But the other thing in this is there's a journey, a life journey there. So, and this for all of you starting out, I think in life's really, really important. You don't know where life's going to take you. I started off as a humble computer programmer, invented a couple of computer programs, and they ended up world class. Never thought I'd be ending up working in peace. But here I am, talking to you all, this accidental man of peace. So now these are the different projects we ran in 2023 in different parts of the world. You'll see they cover all sorts of areas. We work a lot with the military because in a lot of countries the military realise that once you've actually got on top of the insurgents, unless you can provide the people with some sort of viable alternative, they'll go back. They'll go back. Otherwise you need the military there forever. Work with various religious leaders around the world, in many parts of the world. Various different diasporas, ones which, for example, come to Australia. Police, done a lot of work with police around the positive peace architecture. Universities, in fact, I was sitting next to a university professor from Hawaii. He says, yep, we use your course, work all the time in our courses. Work with some of the poorest people in the world. Like semi-nomadic people in Africa, people who are living on 1/10 of a hectare and they're getting one crop a year, people like that. So this framework is applicable not only for highly developed countries, but also working with really very basic communities as well. So I'm just going to step through a couple of the different programs we've worked with. So it's mentioned earlier on, like this is getting implemented by people like Rotary, World Vision, Philippines government, and like could run through 100 organisations, but I won't do that and bore you. Last year, we had projects in over 150 countries around the world. So some of them very small, but 150 countries around the world. We train ambassadors. So if any of you are interested in becoming an IEP ambassador, it's a part-time, 6-week course. We've got 5,500 different ambassadors now in probably over 160 countries. So it also gets covered in hundreds of academic various articles worldwide. I think last year, I think we had about, you've got to get it right, probably about 3,000 different references, academic references in research to work from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And you can find that and we reach organisations in all parts of the world. So like some of the people picking up and using this work on social cohesion are people like UNESCO, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, UNDP, and I could keep going with many, many more. So you can see this work is used a lot, used a lot globally. So I'll come down, I'm just going to quickly step through 3 different projects which we've done. This one sort of moves my heart. It really does. So this guy's one of our ambassadors. He comes from a refugee camp in Uganda. And he sent us in a request at one point asking for pens and papers to run his project. That's give you an idea of what it's like. So we didn't give them to him. But then I saw this photo come through, and given we've got so many coming through, I don't see a lot, but I did see this one that caught my eye. So I thought, wow, what a fantastic project, because you can see what he's doing is organising people in the refugee camp to report human rights abuses. And so that'd be substantial abuses at that. So I thought, that's pretty brave. So next time I was in Kampala, I got him to come down. He told me his life story. So he came from the DRC. His mother and father came from 2 separate tribes, and they set up shop together. They moved in together. Had kids, and then like neither the tribes were all that happy with them setting up together. So one time some thugs came in, attacked his wife, slashed her stomach with a knife because she was pregnant at the time. They got her to a hospital, sewed it up, and then immediately that night left the refugee camps in Uganda. He was 10 years old. So now the guy has done 10 courses similar to ours. He's also got works as a teacher, and from memory I think it's about $20 a month or something he gets working as a teacher. It's not much, but I was talking to him about what he wants to do, and he's passionate about soccer. So he's set up these 2 teams in the camp, or a couple of teams in the camp to play soccer. But he says, we've got no gear, all the balls are all really old and that kind of stuff. So I've got a solid relationship with the Barcelona soccer club. That's his favourite club. So phoned them up, got them, and then shipped over all this gear now. So he's got a couple of outfit to equip 3 soccer teams from to play together. And so what really moves me, is these kind of people who come from really violent backgrounds. And they transcend the violence to now be able to create and work on peace. And I know you're going to hear some stories from some people like this further on, but these are the transformational stories of life. They're the ones which really do motivate me. I'll just give you a couple of other examples. This is in Myanmar after the coup. We ran a series of workshops there, all virtually. Some of them into some of the refugee camps, which and particularly sort of students and other political activists who'd gone to the jungle to live. And so we ran that for a period of time, working with the women and youth in Myanmar. Another example, this is one of my favourites, this is out of Africa. This comes out of a Rotary project. They were working in a school, and what they were finding in the school was a literacy project. After 18 months, no improvement in literacy. So what they did then is they then went in and used the positive peace architecture to determine the outcomes of what they should do for the interventions. And there was a few different interventions which were key. So the thing with the architecture, it's designed from a systemic perspective. So you can come in, and as long as you're hitting each of the items, you're actually replicating quite simplistically, stimulating a system, which I'll come to. But what happened at the back end of this, enrolments went up over 200%, and the literacy attainment rates more than doubled. And it came down to three main things. One was the acceptance of rights of others, and that was for girls. They're finding they weren't coming to school 4 days a year because they're menstruating. Brought in sanitary pads, and then built a couple of toilet blocks, which was a couple of toilets which were separate for them. The second thing was good relationship with neighbours. And what would you think that has anything to do with education? So what they did was they brought in and understood why. And so the kids at lunchtime are hungry, so they're going and raiding all the fruit trees in the various areas around them, because it's a rural area, very, very, very poor rural area. And so they put some fruit trees in the yard and then provide porridge at lunchtime. It's only 2 cents. But that increased the mental capacity of the kids through the afternoon, because what was happening is they're getting so little food that the brains had just fade away as the day wore on. Their energy levels were gone. The lunchtime increased the activity, which meant they doubled their grades. But the other one was free flow of information. So they went on the press and went to the local radio station to talk about what they were doing. What happened then is parents started to send their kids more to school because they knew they were going to get enough feed. Because otherwise they had to go out and rummage from about 7 years on to get food, get their own food. And that altogether came to improve the project. It's a project I love, but that's positive peace in a developmental setting, and that's the kind of work we're looking at doing through World Vision and others. All right, let's move on now. I've got go for another 5 minutes, 7 minutes, then I'll open it up for questions. Now, I realise this is a lot of talking. Anyone fallen asleep? If you've fallen asleep, put your hand up. No? No one wants to put their hand up for falling asleep? Excellent, that's what I want to hear. Is that hand I saw there up? All right, okay, so this gets rather dense, but I think this is important. So if you're looking at where are we now, okay, so if we're looking at a lot of the major underpinnings of modern society, empiricism, okay, that's the study of cause and effect. I'll come to that in a minute, but empiricism will always remain going forward, but it's no longer the leading thing we need. Quantum mechanics has turned a lot of it on its head. We're starting to look at the age of enlightenment, okay, came out of a lot of the modern European philosophers of the 17th, 18th century. So the concept of modern psychology undoes the concept of the rational mind. So we now know it's both rational and irrational, and how do we bring all that together? I think what's missing today is a philosophy which is applicable for the modern age. It's something which has to take into concepts of interdependence, because society now, and it's different over the life I've grown up, different. I can remember my father, like nature was something to be conquered. Today we don't see it that way. We're all interdependent in this common system. We see it internationally, for those who are really international. we can see it in many other ways. So what's missing is a philosophy for the modern age. But enlightenment and empiricism, they're both important concepts, but they're not enough moving forward. So we'll now start to move on from that. So we look at like cause and effect, okay? This is the basis of empiricism. So you've got an input, put it into an experiment as an output, you can then correlate the output. Now, the key thing is the effect is fully contained in the cause. So the effect doesn't influence the cause. That's why I can take this here, throw it up into the air, which I won't do in case I drop it, but I can catch it. It always falls at the same rate. In fact, it's built so deeply into our subconscious, that's why we walk, because of this concept. And empiricism was, because of this, experiments become repeatable. You can do it again and again and again and again, and that creates knowledge. And it's very important, and we won't lose it going forward. But it doesn't work in a social context. It just doesn't work. So now, systems interoperate together. So we'll take the pillars from positive peace. Well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, free flow of information. Does the government affect the flow of information? Or does the flow of information affect the way the government operates? Does corruption affect what information flows through society? Or does the flow of information affect the way corruption's done? Can government control corruption? Or does corruption controlling government? You can't pull any of it apart. So there isn't a concept of causality in this. You could say one influence is stronger than another, but you can't actually say that there's causality. Now, there are very, very good reasons why. As we move a bit further on, we'll look at it. So when you're looking at systems, systems lie within other systems, and so on we can go. Now, there isn't a hierarchy because the very top of the system can operate with the very bottom of the system. And so as we can see, we can start off with a nation that's in part of an international community. It's part of a broader ecosystem, and then we're obviously inside of other systems. If you look inside the nation, you could break it down to a parliament, you could break it down to police, you could break it down to schools. They make subsystems. Important thing to be able to understand a system is what are the bounds of the system. If you can't put the bounds of a system on, you haven't got a system. People think conflict is a system. What are the systemic effects of a conflict? But it's not. A conflict is the relationships and flows between two or more different systems. Right, now this gives a much more complicated view. So what we see here is you have an input coming into a system. Now, the system will try and make a response to it because systems are more like organisms. Human systems are more like organisms than they are like empiricism, cause and effect. Now, within a system, you'll have encoded norms. You also have intent. All systems have intent. So there's an intent. So this is a system here. We're sitting in a system. This system here has an intent, and that intent is to pass knowledge on to you and to enable you to be better leaders going forward. So, something happens. If it's coded norm, if it fits inside the encoded norms, not much happens. It just moves, nothing really happens. Fits within the intent, that's fine. Now, if it's without the intent of the system and it mismatches with the encoded norms, then what happens, the system will try and make a response to go track and correct the input so it doesn't actually now affect the system. That's very, very different than cause and effect. Most governments operate off cause and effect. Where's the problem? I'll fix the problem. But that's an illusion when you start to look at it through systems theory. So now, there's concepts like homeostasis and self-modification. Okay, these are. I'm just starting to hit the surface of this. As people who are interested, we've got a product out called Halo, and so it'll explain in detail how you can go about analysing societal systems. So you've got process assessment. It comes in as a persistent mismatch. The system seeks to modification. It'll create a new encoded norm. And then an encoded norm might be, well, we've got X number of police, as long as the crime rate stays within these realms, well, we're not going to change the number of police. If the crime rates get down and they're too low, then we might have less police. If they get too high, we'll put in more police. So that'll give you an idea of a very simple encoded norm. If inflation goes beyond a certain point, we'll put up interest rates to try and correct inflation and bring it down. If it stays within a certain bounds, then we won't. They're examples of some really simple encoded norms, but there are cultural ones, like whether you queue or you don't queue. I come from a culture of queuing, and I always find it sort of a little bit unsettling being in countries which don't queue, but countries which don't queue find it unsettling having to stand in a queue for so long. But they're examples of other ones. Now, what happens, you then get a new homeostasis. It creates a new encoded norm. So think of homeostasis as a steady state. The system's trying to maintain a steady state. And like if we look at the dynamic and the political processes in any country, the government is always trying to maintain a steady state. So it's about, now think of your body. Your body, this is very analogous, is trying to maintain a steady state. So you want to keep the same temperature. If you get hot, you sweat. If you get cold, you shiver. Heart rate, you want that within certain bounds, and a whole lot of your biomarkers as well, no different. So this is a feedback loop. So this is why 50% of social science experiments can't be replicated, because it's all happening within a system, and systems are dynamic and changing. Now, you've got an historical path. This could be the history, cultural history, it could be the cultural values within the society, it can be its type of economic system, its type of political system, even its social security system. Now, changes. So what happens is you get inputs or shocks to the system. Now, it can go in two ways. One is into a vicious cycle, the other one's into a virtuous cycle. Societal systems are the same. So, the takeaway from that is, now, if you can get things improving along the lines of positive peace, you'll create a virtuous cycle where it's all self-reinforcing. Otherwise, you can create a vicious cycle where things just keep deteriorating. If you come back, this is my final thought on this, if you come back, you start to think about conflict. Countries in conflict, generally, not all of them, but generally, are the poorest countries in the world. We're talking about where the conflict's fought in their own country, okay? We're not talking about external involvement. They're also got the worst ecological outcome, and they're highly, highly violent in every different respect, because crime, murder, it goes with lawlessness. Where you've got conflict, there'll always be lawlessness. Now, I'm just trying to think of a really inspiring note to finish on, but I haven't actually got one in my head. How about that? Okay, so look, what I'd suggest, if anyone's interested in our work, we've got all sorts of things. If you just follow the Global Peace Index, that'll take you back to either Vision of Humanity or take you back to the Institute for Economics and Peace. If you're interested in the Ambassador Program, you can do that. We've also got an online academy which takes a couple of hours on positive peace. So we generally have about, I don't know, maybe, I think it's about 60,000 people a year take that. I was probably more last year. We had just 40,000 people from the Philippines justice system take it. So it's probably more like 80,000 last year. So that'll give you, so if anyone wants to find out more, feel free to.